All right, I think we've given everybody a chance to join in, so we'll get going. So, as we mentioned a couple weeks ago, the focus on today's training is going to be on a few what we're calling quick hits. These are topics that aren't necessarily large enough to warrant their own training session, but they've come up in conversations both internally and with some of our partners, and we wanted to make sure to spend some more time on them today. Uh, Primarily, we're going to be focused on a couple different items. We're going to start with a review of caller ID. We've had a few cases recently where us better defining how that works, I think, would be beneficial to everyone. So we'll be covering that. And then we'll be going in a little more into the user import and provisioning, just do another run through of that on a live system. Uh, Before we get going, I do have a couple other housekeeping notes. Most notably is we will be starting after next week's session, we will be taking a summer break for these. We've really appreciated everyone joining in, but we know that as the summer hits and people are more likely to be traveling, it's going to be harder to get people in. So we want to keep things fresh. We'll have one more session next week, and then we'll be off for the summer. But we'll absolutely be starting this back up as we get into the fall. With that being said, let's go ahead and dive right on in. As we are doing quick hits today and running through on here, if you do have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat or use the raise hand feature. More than happy to try and incorporate those as we go. So what we're going to do first is we're going to touch briefly on caller ID. Caller ID is a feature or is a set of controls that seems like it should be straightforward, but once you start factoring in providers, sometimes can get a little more complex than expected. So we're just going to go through a quick checklist of what to validate to make sure that caller ID is being sent as expected. Uh, One of the most obvious places to start is going to be your outbound routing access codes. Whether that's a no-digit access code or you're doing access with 1 or 2 digit numbers, such as a dial 8 or dial 9 to get to the outside world, everything that goes out of the system, out from an individual tenant, is configured through an access code. Each access code contains one or more trunks, and for those trunks, we have configuration options here for caller ID. We've touched on this before, so I do apologize if we're doing a little bit of a retread, but we want to make sure because there's a couple things that can trip people up. We want to make sure we cover here. Uh, Caller ID is configured per trunk. We do this on purpose because even though, or per carrier, I should say to be accurate, even though the caller ID values generally are something that we expect to be consistent on a given outbound call, once we start factoring in support for on-premises customers, especially those who are using trunks other than West Telecom supplied trunks, we know we need to have some additional flexibility when it comes to the caller ID values. Most notably, and this is going to be less and less of an issue unless you're either supporting an existing install or supporting a customer with a legacy requirement. A lot of PRI providers are set so that you cannot send out a caller ID number that doesn't belong to them, at least without additional configuration, depending on the provider. If you're sending out a number that's other than expected or other than supported by their system, they may overwrite that value. That's your best case scenario. Or in some cases, they may even reject the call entirely. To that end, we give you a lot of different controls for how we handle these outbound routing. And once you're into this access code and digit map section, or in the digit map and dial plan, you're not really thinking about or you're not having to worry about the individual trunk type. We can set these the same across the board um, and handle it there. One other note, just to make sure we're covering all the details, is of course if you're on analog circuits, especially say a backup connection for a on-premises deployment, uh, you're not going to have any caller ID control over those. That's going to be entirely based on the provider. We offer three different modes on these access codes for caller ID. Per extension is the default that you're going to see most commonly. We also offer a flavor of per extension with pass-through, and then we have a use default. Use default uses explicitly what's set as the default number and default name values below. Uh, Again, coming back to providers, the number is something that will almost always be honored by your provider in terms of sending an outbound caller ID. Name, in most cases, at least in the US, while we will transmit it, especially over SIP trunks, we can make no guarantee that that's going to carry through. I do raise that as something that's specific to the US. If you're supporting Canadian installs, for example, we found that many more of the trunk providers up there will actually attempt to pass through your caller ID values on here, which is why we allow for those controls. But generally in the US, since the receiving carrier is going to be the one providing the caller ID name, that's going to be outside of the UC. We still let you set it for consistency's sake and for those edge cases where it may actually make a difference. Per extension and per extension pass-through still use and rely on these default values if nothing else has been set, but they do allow us to go in on the individual user or with a template to update those further. Per extension says, either use the default number or something set in the extension, send it through here, but only those numbers are allowed through. If we say per extension with pass-through, what this means is if we're doing call forwarding, whether that's through an option at an auto attendant, a manual call forward from a user transferring a caller, or a user extension set for a to ring to a cell phone, for example, those will all carry through. If you are in the pass-through mode, they'll actually carry through or attempt to carry through the original caller's caller ID. The reason we give you the control here is because, as I was mentioning, you will run into carriers, especially carriers providing PRI lines that will not support pass-through. They only will support numbers that they know about on their switch and they control. So we want to make sure that you have that level of granularity and control to make sure that you're not getting calls rejected or things unexpectedly rewritten upstream. Also want to talk a little bit about billing number, and then we'll go into the individual users and talk about settings there. For the billing number, we have a per extension or use default. There are a couple differences with billing number as opposed to the caller ID values, but a couple just general notes before we dive too deep in the billing number side. First is billing number only applies to certain SIP trunks. If we come in over to a SIP trunk configuration, where you're going to hit using a billing number is only if you're in a SIP trunk where the header is set to the billing number type. What this allows you to do is a case where you need to send a one number as your from for accounting purposes, but you may be sending a different number in generally the remote party ID field for outbound caller ID. These days, generally, you can either leave it as billing number or for West Telecom trunks or for other providers, you may have a custom value or you may match the username that's been provided for it here. Again, anything we talk about with billing number only comes into play in this one case with a SIP trunk that is set to use the from user type of billing number. Everything outside of that, that value is can be left as default or just per extension. It'll pick up in a manner I'll cover in just a moment. So that being said, the default for billing numbers, we're going to set it per extension, but you can also set a default value on here. The difference between caller ID and billing number is that default values are only used if the mode is explicitly set to use default. If it's set to per extension, there's another set of rules we'll cover on the user extension side that controls what number to send as that value. But if you want it to be a specific number, we want to make sure we set that to a use default. That way caller ID can still be whatever it is, but we'll allow the default number to be a consistent known value. Again, there's only a certain type of SIP trunk where this is going to matter, but I do want to make sure we're covering that because that was an area that got some feedback on that was a little unclear from previous training sessions. So we talked about the SIP trunks. We've talked about PRI trunks, why we have the controls for different caller ID. We're just going to hop on over quickly and talk about what an individual user configuration looks like as it relates to caller ID. On here, we have a caller ID section inside the user's profile page. We have controls for internal, external, and billing number. For the internal, this lets you set and control the display name that's provided when calling to another station internally to the UC. Otherwise, is not used. It's going to be overwritten in most cases when you send to the outside world. For external, by default, you'll see we're using those default values that come in from the access codes and carriers that are set there. We can also explicitly set those. So this would be a case where you want to have, say, a different department or a different site have different caller ID values. We build a template and assign it out to these users with those values. And if we want, we can also use the internal name, or if a DID number is assigned, we can tell it to use the DID number for that user. This is really going to depend on, pardon me, this is really going to depend on the nature of your deployments. For a lot of customers, they want to send the DID, but there's an equal number that want to always send their main number. And even if a DID is assigned to an individual extension, they don't want that going to the outside world on every outbound call. One note is if I do enable, say, use DID number here, and we're in a case such as this where I don't have a DID number assigned for voice, it's going to fall back and it's going to use those default values. So in cases where you do want this on a supported or on a deployment, you can set this in your template, safely apply it to everyone, and those users that don't have a DID number will just fall back to your main values or your default values that are set in the outbound routing access code screen. The other control I want to touch on, and again, only matters if we support pass-through on the access code and carriers configuration, is the disable caller ID pass-through control. Some of our initial deployments where we were supporting pass-through, we got feedback that 90% of the customers preferred pass-through, but there was a 10% case where, they wanted to make sure that they could control, oh, I know this is a work call because it's my work number, if they were, say, forwarding to a cell phone number. And for those cases, we allow on an individual basis to ignore the pass-through state, even if it's allowed on the carrier. This is a rare case, but do want to make sure we're defining our terms here. And finally, on the billing number side, we have that same use DID number where we can support that. We can explicitly put a number in here. This will only apply again in cases where your billing type is set to from, or your from is set to the billing number, and you're using per extension modes on your carriers. And then you can either explicitly set that number in here, or if you leave it blank, it is going to use whatever it is determined for caller ID. For most of your deployments these days, since most carriers don't have a requirement about billing numbers, using just the default here where we're basically not setting anything for billing numbers, just allowing it to use caller ID. And on the access code side, keeping that billing number mode as per extension is going to cover you. There's generally not going to need to bring in more there. But if you have a provider who you want to track differently based or send calls differently based on their accounting system, for example, that's where billing number comes into play. Next up, we're going to take a brief look at users and devices, touch on user imports, and another provisioning. So we're going to import a batch of users here, get them set up, and actually go through the whole import process. We're going to do this live, so there'll be a little bit of typing on my end as we go, but want to make sure that I don't skip over any part of the process for you. And then as a reminder, as I'm doing this, if you do have questions, feel free to let me know, and I can touch on those as we build this up. First thing, or Frank, is there a question you had?
No.
Oh, I just saw your audio flip for a second there, so I wanted to be
Oh,
sure.
sorry.
All good. First thing we're going to want to do is set up to import our users. You can import users off of a CSV file, and we know that figuring out the format of a CSV file is always a pain, so you can just click Download Template to capture that here. I'm going to open that up in just a second, and we'll come on through. All right, when we're taking a look at the CSV file, we want to make sure we keep it as a CSV, but we can do resizing and all of that in the meantime as we set things up. We've touched on these before, but I do want to go through, give definitions for each of these again, and touch on which ones are required versus which ones are optional fields. Employee ID, if present, can be used as the key reference value for an individual user. This can be really useful in cases where, for example, you want to deal with name changes, or things like email address and the like may change, but it is technically an optional field. If an employee ID value is set, it needs to be unique per user. So I could have, setting 11111 here. Only one of these users would be imported. If I was to upload this, you get an error on the results that explain why. But if I set a unique employee ID for each one, those would import separately. This is something that if you have that information, it's nice to put in here, especially when you do an import, but is really going to be useful not at your initial setup as much as if you need to come back later. Because we talk about user import as a way to load new unassigned users into the system. But for any of these other cases, you can also use this to update some of these other values. So let's say, for example, that you needed to change a listed phone number or set a listed fax number for users. If you have users that are distinguishable by employee ID or a combination of first name and last name, which is the other case we'll cover in a moment here, you can import that user, you can re-import the data for that user and update these other fields. So an employee ID for your initial import isn't going to make the biggest difference in the world because you're not doing a lot with it. But once you come into, if you ever need to come back and update users later, the ability to reference this particular employee ID does save you a significant chunk of time rather than having to go through and build other templates or touch user extensions and update their profiles one by one. Next up, we're going to touch on username. Username is what a user uses to log into their portal. So this is going to be, by default, it's first name dot last name. If you're on a multi-tenanted system, the system will add in the at whatever the tenant is that is not required for the import side of things. So if that's set, great. If it is not set, it's going to build that off of display name is the same. The difference is rather than being first name dot last name, it's going to be first name space last name. So it's going to cover those values on here. As I mentioned, there's several different items that the UC will look for to determine uniqueness when it comes to a imported user. Employee ID, if present, will take priority. Combination of first name and last name will follow up. Last name will be attempted if that is unique, but generally, if you do want to re-import over it, the safest thing to value is going to be your employee ID. The safest value to use is employee ID. Every item we've touched on so far, including first name, is technically optional. Like you can import users. They're highly recommended, but you can import users without setting any of these values. Last name is required. That's the minimum required to set up a user. And we'll see this the same when we come in and try and manually build a new user. pull that back over here. So if I try and build a new user by hand, this is the same process that is handled with the import, just rather than doing it with a pardon me, rather than doing it with a CSV, we can import it or create the users manually here. You'll see that last name is the only required field. Everything else, again, we highly recommend placing it in there. It makes things a lot easier to work with, but is not required. Switching back over to our CSV, title, department, and manager. These are all fall into, if we take a look at a user here, uh, what we call these report categories alongside listed site and site location. These things are used when searching for users because they'll show up in, say, your directory search, and then they're also used in your reporting. You can filter based on department or manager and group results that way. But again, these are optional. Whenever I have this information, I like to put it in. Um, but if you don't have it there, it's not the end of the world. Language is going to default to English if not set. You can either put that in here. We can also select Spanish at this time. That doesn't do uh, a ton of additional configuration, but it does some basic setup for certain built-in features to support some more flexibility. Most of our deployments, though, especially in the US, we're going to assume English. So if you leave that off, it'll default to English. Email addresses are, again, optional. If set, when you set up a user, unless you modify your template, they will configure notifications off of that email. It's also used for password reset emails and events on there. Very useful to have. Much better to import it once rather than have to go back in and update your users later. But this is something that, again, is optional. Listed phone number and listed fax number are both primarily used for provisioning. So if I need to provision out DID numbers, I can, or individual extensions, I can use the listed fax number to do so. If I want to assign a fax DID to a user, I can actually build a template, and I can cover that in a moment. That will do a fax DID based off of that same listed fax number. One other note on here is that listed fax is a required value if you want to enable the user portal send fax feature, because that's used to set the header that's actually written on the top of the fax when it's transmitted. So, again, we talk about only last name being required, but listed fax number is highly recommended if you're enabling that fax feature here. One other note, listed phone number, you'll see in most of our demonstrations that we set it as a 10-digit DID. It is also an option to set this as a what your extension would be, and we can build out a template that's going to assign either way. Generally, as a best practice, I stick with this as the DID number, but you do have some flexibility there. Your mobile number is what's used to provision a few features. One is on your user routing screens. This is what allows you to have options to route to a mobile number directly. So if you've got people who occasionally need to get calls to their cell phones, but you don't want to set up or they don't want to have the mobile app for whatever reason, mobile numbers being included on the import are going to save a ton of time, because that can auto provision that part, which means we can build a template to cover the rest of it. The other thing this does is we have a feature, and it's not as commonly used these days, but again, with the rise in the use of the app, but when you're on a phone call on any TO extension, if you have a mobile number configured on your extension, you can dial *8, the system's going to actually place a call out to that mobile number. You can answer it, and then you'll be uh, presented with a message asking if you want to transfer the call over and to dial 1 if you intend to do so. If you do that, it's going to transfer the call over to your mobile number, hang up the call on whatever device you were talking on before, and as seamless as possible to the person you were talking with, you'll be able to continue the call uh, without needing to use the app or to use anything else. So we do some fancy forwarding features with these mobile numbers as well. Listed site name and inside location are going to come into play in a couple different areas. The most important area is going to be search and reporting, similar to what we see with department and manager, because those are going to allow us to uh, quickly identify users that if we're looking for users that should be at a particular site, particular location, we can filter just on those values. Uh, it also is used on things like 911 notifications. The email version of that, I believe, will also include your information here in addition to what's set as your site and zone. That being said, we've built a couple of users, or we've built a user. I'm going to keep, in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and save this. We'll hop back on over and import this user. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this through. So this is the CSV file I just updated. The biggest difference between what we're doing with this import screen and what the old import screen does is we give you much more details on the results. So when it processes, it gives you the values. It tells you who was created, if someone was updated, it'll tell you there. So in this case, I just updated that CSV, so it's going to switch the display name around. I can actually re-import it here, and you'll see the user was updated instead because we do have that unique employee ID that we set on here. So you'll get a full report of everyone that's updated, and if there's an error or a conflict for whatever reason, you'll see where that occurred and why that occurred. It makes it much faster to validate what you're uploading and be confident that you're moving on to the next step. Once your users are uploaded here, they're going to show up in unassigned users. Now we have a lot of unassigned users in this list already, but we have the new user we just created here, and I just switched so we have everything in as built, and I just switched the caller ID information on that update. So see that here as well. From this point, you can go ahead and you use your templates as normal to deploy those users out. Uh, I'm going to go ahead and just make a couple quick changes to our default template, and we'll get this user set. I'm going to make sure they go into an emergency site and zone. I'm going to tell it I want to use the DID number if present for the caller ID. And I'm going to, because we have a mobile number in here, I'm going to say, if you're offline, go ahead and try to forward to your mobile number. I'm going to come over to provisioning. We can either provision existing users or add new users with this. We're going to go ahead and add a new user using the default I just saved. And we'll take this user here, and then we can choose how to assign them. We can do this assigning to an extension in one of three ways. We can do a first available, where take whatever is available inside of a given range. We can do it based on the listed phone number. We can do it based on the DID number that's assigned. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to give myself a nice wide range, knowing that this is a demo system that a lot of people have been on. And I'm going to say just assign it to the first available on here. And then I'm going to say under the voice DID number, again, I have options for first available or listed phone. In almost every case here, you're almost certainly going to want to use listed values if you have them. and then you can do the same thing for a fax number. Generally don't recommend using first available unless you're building up a brand new system where you just need to get those users in and they don't have existing numbers they need to carry over or that they care about. I can see my users here. I can see what's going to be set. I'll go ahead and provision this out. And we've got an error here because I assigned a range where I didn't actually have an extension block in here. So you get that result back. You'll see it wasn't provisioned, but it was completed. If I come over to the digit map here, you'll see that's because I said to start with a 3-digit, and this is actually starting with a 2-digit value. If I pop back over to the user devices and provision again, just bring that range start down to 10. Fire that off, and then in just a second I'll get the update that that's completed, but we can actually hop over already and should see that momentarily. One note I want to bring up on this provisioning is that the more of these fields that you select to provision, the more likely you might run into a conflict. So for example, if I'm provisioning a voice DID number as a listed phone number, and I already have that in other cases, you're going to hit a conflict here where if you don't have a number set, uh, it's going to go ahead and immediately run through. Other note, very briefly, just to wrap things up, is if I do set a new DID number as a listed number here, one of the things that the system will do is actually add it to this list for you, so you don't have to manually add those DID numbers in to your tracking. Generally, that means you're only entering in values that are used for auto attendance and other non-user extension destinations. All right, so to kind of wrap things up, and again, we are leaving time if you've got questions, anything else we should cover, happy to do so. This is intended as your time for your benefit, so please don't be shy. We're going to have one more session next week where we're going to give you a preview of what's coming up in our 562 build that we expect to have out shortly. And then we're going to be taking our summer break. Do keep an eye on, as we get later into the summer, keep an eye on our communications. We will be sending out updates to start up another round of sessions in the fall. But we wanted to give everyone a chance to take vacation and not have one more thing on their calendar to think about. Uh, just because we're taking a summer break from these trainings, though, doesn't mean we're not available for you. If you ever have any questions, reach out to our team. We're happy to help out. With that, unless anybody has questions, I will give everybody back a few minutes in there and